We want to share a few housekeeping notes for today's event. Live automated captions are available. If the captions did not show up for you automatically, please click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen to view subtitles. Before we start today's program, we'd like to share a land acknowledgement. We'd like to recognize the Indigenous people whose land we are on today. Highline College itself, and where so many of us live and work, resides on ancestral native lands of the Duwamish Nation. And depending on exact cities in this region, many of us live and work on the Muckleshoot, Duwamish, and Puyallup lands. We honor the land and give gratitude to the First Nations people that are here, who continue to steward this land since time immemorial. To learn more about native land, please check out the Native Land Project and the interactive map, which is available at nativelands.ca. We also encourage you to learn more about Indigenous studies through our library resource guide. Further, we respectfully acknowledge the enslaved people, primarily of African descent, who provided the exploited labor on which this country's foundations were built, with little to no recognition. Today, we are indebted to their labor and the labor of so many Black and brown bodies that continue to work in the shadows for our collective benefit. We encourage you to learn more about Black studies on the library's anti-racist library resource guide. So thank you all. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the amazing Rachel Stuart, Communications faculty. She'll be reading aloud from Travels with Charley by John Steinbeck. And please stay for an optional brief discussion afterwards. So that's it for housekeeping details. Get comfortable, grab your coffee, grab your caffeine, and welcome Rachel Stuart.
Thank you. What a wonderful, wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. So today I will be reading from Travels with Charley by John Steinbeck. It's In Search of America, and this is it's one of his nonfiction books where he talks about his 3-month journey throughout the United States with his blue poodle, Charley. The reason why this book was of interest to us, to me specifically, was that in May of 2015, my wife, Kara, and I embarked on a 12-month, 47,000-mile journey in a 19-foot Class B motorhome with our 2 cats. It was a very long and amazing journey. So while I read some excerpts, I will stop in between and give a little bit of perspective as well from our journey on the road. In addition, I will have highlights here and y'all are still married. We did it. Yes, Monica, it was 3 months. We'd been married 3 months when we went on the trip. And the joke is that if we were married and if we were still married afterward, we would be with each other forever. And look at that, not only are we still together, but we also worked together. So without further ado, let's get this going. Excellent. So here we are, and here is Travels with Charley. When I was very young and the urge to be someplace else was on me, I was assured by mature people that maturity would cure this itch. When years described me as mature, the remedy prescribed was middle age. In middle age, I was assured that greater age would calm my fever, and now that I am 58, perhaps senility will do the job. Nothing has worked. 4 hoarse blasts of a ship's whistle still raise the hair on my neck and set my feet to tapping. The sound of a jet, an engine warming up, even the clopping of shod hooves on pavement brings on the ancient shudder, the dry mouth and vacant eye, the hot palms and the churn of stomach high up under the rib cage. In other words, I don't improve. In further words, once a bum, always a bum. I fear the disease is incurable. I set this matter down not to instruct others, but to inform myself. When the virus of restlessness begins to take possession of a wayward man, and the road away from here seems broad and straight and sweet, the victim must first find in himself a good and sufficient reason for going. This to the practical bum is not difficult. He has a built-in garden of reasons to choose from. Next, he must plan his trip in time and space, choose a direction and a destination. And at last, he must implement the journey, how to go, what to take, how long to stay. This part of the process is invariable and immortal. I set it down only so that newcomers to bumdom, like teenagers in new-hatched sin, will not think they invented it. Once a journey is designed, equipped, and put in process, a new factor enters and takes over. A trip, a safari, an exploration is an entity different from all other journeys. It has personality, temperament, individuality, uniqueness. A journey is a person in itself. No two are alike. And all plans, safeguards, policing, and coercion are fruitless. We find after years of struggle that we do not take a trip takes us. Tour masters' schedules, reservations, brass bound and inevitable, dash themselves to wreckage on the personality of the trip. Only when this is recognized can the blown in the glass bum relax and go along with it. Only then do the frustrations fall away. In this, a journey is like marriage. The certain way to be wrong is to think you control it. I feel better now, having said this, although only those who have experienced it will understand it. So what was really interesting when we were on the trip was that there would be times where we'd be talking to people back home or wherever, asking about what was going on. And I remember at one point, one of Kara's closest friends said, "What are y'all stressed about? It's a vacation." And it was not a vacation. It was a road trip. There is something that's very different from being on the road for a year and being quite literally transient, and having sort of a destination with sort of set plans and everything included. When we set out on our journey to find America, it was one of the first things that Kara and I actually bonded with. Both of us had this dream to go on this trip before we'd met each other. And when we met each other, it was something that we bonded over. Kara had it very much in planning stages and was planning to take this trip alone. And matter of fact, our first Christmas together, she got me plane tickets to be able to visit her wherever she was going to be at that time. Very quickly, when it became obvious that we were serious as a couple, I got sort of incorporated into it. And the trip itself was very nebulous in a lot of ways. We knew we wanted to see America, and we both had our reasons for it. And we had a couple of things that we knew that we wanted to do. One of them was to visit as many national parks and monuments as we could. And the other was to visit as many football stadiums as we could, if we could visit all of them. In addition, there were certain places that we wanted to be, like we wanted to be in New England for the fall. But other than that, the road was our destination. And we spent a lot of time sort of trying to find places to stay. We slept in a lot of Walmart parking lots and figuring out where we were going to go next. I think one of the most amazing things that we discovered when we were on the trip was that pretty soon we became able to recognize sort of small differences between each state. It was interesting when we crossed over these invisible barriers of state lines, we started to notice just small differences in the landscape, in the roads. And then obviously we started to pick up on small differences in how people spoke or products. And in this way, we started to see how the United States gradually changes everywhere you go. So John Steinbeck picks up on this as well. He talks about the differences in the states. I crossed into New York State at Rouse's Point and stayed as near to Lake Ontario as I could because it was my intention to look at Niagara Falls, which I had never seen, and then slip into Canada from Hamilton to Windsor, keeping Lake Erie on the south, and to emerge at Detroit, a kind of end run, a small triumph over geography. We know, of course, that each of our states is an individual and proud of it. Not content with their names, they take descriptive titles also. The Empire State, the Garden State, the Granite State, titles proudly borne and little given to understatements. But now for the first time, I became aware that each state also had its individual prose style, made sharply evident in its highway signs. Crossing state lines, one is aware of this change of language. The New England states use a terse form of instruction, a tight-lipped, laconic street style sheets, wasting no words and few letters. Do this, do that, squeeze left, squeeze right. Every few feet, an imperious command. In Ohio, the signs are more benign. They offer friendly advice and are more like suggestions. Some states use a turgid style, which can get you lost with the greatest ease. There are states which tell you what you may expect to find in the way of road conditions ahead, while others let you find out for yourself. Nearly all have abandoned the adverb for the adjective. Drive slow, drive safe. I am an avid reader of all signs, and I find that in the historical markers, the prose of statehood reaches its glorious best and most lyric. I have further established, at least to my own satisfaction, that those states with the shortest histories and the least world-shaking events have the most historical markers. Some Western states even find glory in half-forgotten murders and bank robberies. The towns not to be left behind proudly announce their celebrated sons, so the traveler is informed by signs and banners. Birthplace of Elvis Presley, Cole Porter, of Alan P. Huggins. This is no new thing, of course. I seem to remember that small cities in ancient Greece quarreled bitterly over which was the birthplace of Homer. Within my memory, an outraged hometown citizenry wanted Red Lewis back for tarring and feathering after he wrote Main Street. And today, Salk Center celebrates itself for having produced him. We, as a nation, are as hungry for history as was England when Geoffrey of Monmouth concocted his history of British kings, many of whom he manufactured to meet the growing demands. And as states and communities, so in individual Americans, this hunger for decent association with the past. Genealogists are worked to death winnowing the debris of ancestry for grains of greatness. Not long ago, it was proved that Dwight D. Eisenhower was descended from the royal line of Britain. Proof, if one were needed, that everyone is descended from everyone. The then little town where I was born, which within my grandfather's memory was a blacksmith shop and a swamp, recalls with yearly pageantry a glowing past of Spanish dons and rosating senoritas who have in public memory wiped out the small, desolate tribe of grub and grasshopper-eating Indians who are our first true settlers. I find this interesting, but it does make for suspicion of history as a record of reality. I thought of these things as I read the historical markers across the country, thought of how the myth wipes out the fact. On a very low level, the following is the process of a myth. Visiting in the town where I was born, I talked with a very old man who had known me as a child. He remembered vividly seeing me, a peaked, shivering child, walking past his house one freezing morning, my inadequate overcoat fastened across my little chest with horse blanket pins. This, in its small way, is the very stuff of myths. The poor and suffering child who rises to glory on a limited scale, of course. Even though I didn't remember the episode, I knew it could not be true. My mother was a passionate sewer on of buttons. A button off was more than sloppiness. It was a sin. If I had pinned my coat, my mother would have wailed me. The story could not be true. But this old gentleman so loved it that I could never convince him of its falsity, so I didn't try. If my hometown wants me in horse blanket pins, nothing I can do is likely to change it, particularly the truth. I think what was really interesting was a big part for me for this trip and this yearning to go on this trip, well before I ever met Kara, was wanting to know what this country was. I was born and raised in California. I still maintain from a local perspective that the West Coast is the best coast, but I also wanted to go and see for myself what this country was about. So much of our country is built on myth and built on sort of this massive game of telephone. And if you've never been to places like, let's say, Florida, you may think that Florida is only that of the stories we hear about. Florida man does this or Florida man does that, right? And so it was a big part of this trip was to just discover America and to see what it was actually about. What is interesting about this as well is my own sort of theory and my hypothesis that is pretty well shared, that especially Americans who can trace their ancestry back, especially white Americans can trace it back to Europe, is that we were the wanderers. We were the ones who left home for whatever reason. And so many people from all over the world come to America searching, and oftentimes are seen as those who leave, right? The ones who want to find something better, who want to search out in something better. And I've always thought that people on the West Coast were the ones who had a very restless heart because their ancestors continued to move. What's interesting about this is Steinbeck picks up on something very similar, and this concept of what does it mean to have roots and what does it mean to want to wander? And so John Steinbeck finds himself near Toledo, Ohio, talking with his dog Charley about the subject of roots. Driving the big highway near Toledo, I had a conversation with Charley on the subject of roots. He listened, but he didn't reply. In the pattern thinking about roots, I and most other people have left two things out of consideration. Could it be that Americans are a restless people, a mobile people, never satisfied with where they are as a matter of selection? The pioneers, the immigrants who peopled the continent were the restless ones in Europe. The steady rooted ones stayed home and are still there. But every one of us, except the Africans forced here as slaves, are descended from the restless ones, the wayward ones who were not content to stay at home. Wouldn't it be unusual if we had not inherited this tendency? And the fact is that we have, but that's the short view. What are roots and how long have we had them? If our species has existed for a couple million years, what is its history? Our remote ancestors followed the game, moved with the food supply, and fled from evil weather, from ice and the changing seasons. Then after millennia beyond thinking, they domesticated some animals so that they lived with their food supply. Then of necessity, they followed the grass that fed their flocks in endless wanderings. Only when agriculture came into practice, and that's not very long ago in terms of the whole history, did a place achieve meaning and value and permanence. But land is a tangible, and tangibles have a way of getting into a few hands. Thus, it was that one man wanted ownership of land and at the same time wanted servitude because someone had to work it. Roots were in ownership of land, intangible and immovable possessions. In this view, we are a restless species with a very short history of roots, and those are not widely distributed. Perhaps we have overrated roots as a psychic need. Perhaps we have, maybe the greater the urge, the deeper and more ancient is the need. the will, the hunger to be somewhere else. What's interesting is that this trip definitely did not cure the desire to see the world, to see where we are and where we come from. If anything, for me, the trip deepened that hunger to know more about the world. After seeing the United States, what I was really struck by was that each one of them does really have its own unique little personality. And I think even more so, what I found was that we have so much more in common than we have difference. But those differences also do need to be respected. I think what was fascinating is this was a great time to sort of be in a constant state of culture shock in a very sort of small way, because I was so used to sort of this West Coast way of life that it was very strange for me to sort of have this cognitive dissonance of being in my own country while also feeling like an outsider, of being the one who had an accent, of being the one who was the outsider. And it made me realize sort of how comfortable I had become in my rootedness on the West Coast. What also struck me was that, we have this concept of like emic knowledge and edict knowledge. And so edict knowledge being that from the outside, right? We get this outside perspective. Emic knowledge being that from within. And I think so much we assume that we know something about a place, or we know something about where we are or what's going on based upon something like technology, right? We have all of these images and we can experience it. And I have a lot of pros and cons about that. I study technology and communication. That's my area of study, is looking at how rural populations of minorities and marginalized individuals in rural populations use technology for community and identity negotiation. But also trying to understand sort of what technology does, both good and bad, and how that might actually create sort of differences in reality as well. What lived experience is as opposed to what the learned experience is. So John Steinbeck was wary of technology. And it's interesting to read this because he went on this trip in 1960, and he died about 6 years afterward. But he has a lot of laments about sort of what technology may be doing to culture, which is exactly what my study is. So this was interesting. So he talks about wanting to quite literally hear how people speak. He wanted to hear differences of communication as he traveled the United States. And this is what he says. One of my purposes was to listen, to hear speech, accents, speech rhythms, overtones, and emphasis. For speech is so much more than words and sentences. I did listen everywhere. It seemed to me that regional speech is in the process of disappearing, not gone, but going. 40 years of radio and 20 years of television must have this impact. Communications must destroy localness by a slow, inevitable process. I can remember a time when I could almost pinpoint a man's place of origin by his speech. That is growing more difficult now and will, in some foreseeable future, become impossible. It is a rare house or building that is not rigged with spiky combers of the air. Radio and television speech become standardized, perhaps better English than we have ever used. Just as our bread, mixed and baked, packaged and sold without benefit of accident or human frailty, is uniformly good and uniformly tasteless, so will our speech become one speech. Awesome. I, who love words and endless possibility of words, am saddened by this inevitability. For with local accent will disappear local tempo. The idioms, the figures of speech that make language rich and full of the poetry of place and time must go. And in their place will be a national speech, wrapped in packaged, standard, and tasteless. Localness is not gone, but it is going. In the many years since I've traveled to the land, the change is very great. Traveling west along the northern routes, I did not hear a truly local speech until I reached Montana. That is one of the reasons I fell in love again with Montana. The West Coast went back to packaged English. The Southwest kept a grasp, but a slipping grasp on localness. Of course, the Deep South holds on by main strength to its regional expressions, just as it holds and treasures some other anachronisms. But no region can hold out for long against the highway, the high tension line, and the national television. What I am mourning is perhaps not worth saving, but I regret its loss nonetheless. Even while I protest the assembly line production of our food, our songs, our language, and eventually our souls, I know that it is a rare home that baked good bread in the old days. My mother's cooking was with rare exceptions poor, and that good unpasteurized milk touched only by flies and bits of manure crawled with bacteria. The healthy old-time life was riddled with aches, sudden death from unknown causes, and that sweet local speech I mourn was the child illiteracy and ignorance. It is the nature of a man as he grows older, a small bridge in time to protest against change, particularly change for the better. But it is true that we have exchanged corpulence for starvation, and either one will kill us. The lines of change are down. We, or at least I, can have no conception of human life and human thought in 100 years or 50 years. Perhaps my greatest wisdom is the knowledge that I do not know. The sad ones are those who waste their energy in trying to hold it back, for they can only feel bitterness and loss and no joy in gain. I can't say that I necessarily hold John Steinbeck's feelings about technology in the same way. Technology was very helpful for us on the trip. I genuinely have no idea what would have happened if we didn't have GPS. And I don't know what we would have done if it hadn't have been for this amazing website, which is now an app called Allstays, which told us exactly which Walmarts love to have RVers park in their parking lots at night. So essentially places to stay, which is one of the ways that we were able to make the trip affordable, was that about 90% of our trip, we were lodging in the back of Walmart parking lots in what we call the Village, which was other RVers who knew that as well. There it is, allstays.com. So technology was helpful for all sorts of reasons. It was what made our trip sort of as spontaneous as it could be. It also allowed for our families to know where we were, which there were plenty of times where it was good for them to be able to do that. We had, which I'll talk about later afterward, the unfortunate run-in with a grizzly bear in Teton National Park. And it was at that point we realized that not only did nobody in our family or our friends know where we were, they literally didn't even know what state we were in. So we realized sort of how nice it was that they'd be able to at least track us with technology. The interesting part is John Steinbeck asks the question of, well, what did he find? And he has this long conversation with his dog Charley again, where he starts to suss out about halfway through the trip of what it is that he has found through his travels in America. He says, "It was only shortly after noon, but I was so relaxed and comfortable I hated to move. Should we stay the night, Charley?" He inspected me and wagged his tail as a professor wags a pencil. once to the left, once to the right, and returned to center. I sat on the bank, took off socks and boots, and dipped my feet in water so cold it burned until the freezing went deep and deadened feeling. My mother believed that cold water on the feet forced the blood to your head so that you thought better. Time for examination, mon vieux chamal, I said aloud, which is another way of saying I feel comfortably lazy. I came on this trip to try to learn something of America. Am I learning anything? If I am, I don't know what it is.
How big it
So
is.
far, I could go back with a bag full of conclusions, a cluster of answers to riddles. I doubt it, but maybe. When I go to Europe, when I am asked, what is America like? What will I say? I don't know. Well, using your olfactory method of investigation, what have you learned, my friends? 2 complete wags. At least he didn't leave the question open. Does all America so far smell alike, or are there sectional smells? Charley began to turn around and around to the left, and then he reversed and turned 8 times to the right before he finally settled and put his nose on his paws and his head within reach of my hands. He has a hard time getting down. When he was young, a car hit him and broke his hip. He wore a cast for a long time. Now, in his golden age, his hip troubles him when he is tired. After too long a run, he limps on his right hind leg. But because of his long turning before lying down, we sometimes call him a whirlpoodle, much to our shame. If my mother's rule was right, I was thinking pretty well. But she also said cold feet, warm heart, and that's a different matter.
Cold feet.
I had parked well away from the road and from my traffic for my time and rest and read. I am serious about this. I did not put aside my sloth for the sake of a few amusing anecdotes. I came with the wish to learn what America is like, and I wasn't sure I was learning anything. I found I was talking aloud to Charley. He likes the idea, but the practice makes him sleepy. Just for ducks, let's try a little of what my boys would call this generality jazz. Underheads and subheads. Let's take food and as we have found it. It is more than possible that in cities we have passed through, traffic harried, there are good and distinguished restaurants with menus of delight. But in the eating places along the roads, the food has been clean, tasteless, colorless, and of a complete sameness. It is almost as though the customers had no interest in what they ate, as long as they had no character to embarrass them. This is true of all but the breakfasts, which are uniformly wonderful if you stick to bacon and eggs and fried potatoes. At the roadsides, I never had a really good dinner or a really bad breakfast. The bacon or sausage was good and packaged at the factory, the eggs fresh or kept fresh by refrigeration, and the refrigeration was universal. I might even say roadside America is the paradise of breakfast except for one thing. Now and then I would see a sign that said homemade sausage or home smoked bacon and hams or new laid eggs, and I would stop and lay in supplies. Then, cooking my own breakfast and making my own coffee, I found that the difference was instantly apparent. A freshly laid egg does not taste remotely like the pale battery-produced refrigerated egg. The sausage would be sweet and sharp and pungent with spices, and my coffee a wine-dark happiness. Can I then say that the America I saw has put cleanliness first at the expense of taste? And since all our perceptive nerve trunks, including that of taste, are not only perfectible but also capable of trauma, that the sense of taste tends to disappear and that strong, pungent, or exotic flavors arouse suspicion and dislike and so are eliminated. Let's go a little farther into the fields, Charley. Let's take a look at books, magazines, and papers we have seen displayed where we have stopped. The dominant publication is the comic book. There have been local papers and I have bought and read them. There have been racks of paperbacks, some with great and good titles, but overwhelmingly outnumbered by the volumes of sex, sadism, and homicide. The big city papers cast their shadows over large areas around them. The New York Times as far as the Great Lakes, the Chicago Tribune all the way here to North Dakota. Here, Charley, I give you a warning, should you be drawn to generalities. If this people has so atrophied its taste buds as to find tasteless food not only acceptable but desirable, what of the emotional life of the nation? Do they find their emotional fare so bland that it must be spiced with sex and sadism through the medium of the paperback? And if this is so, why are there no condiments save ketchup and mustard to enhance their foods? We've listened to local radio all across the country, and apart from a few reportings of football games, the mental fare has been generalized, as packaged, as undistinguished as the food. I stirred Charley with my foot to keep him awake. I had been keen to hear what people thought politically. Those of whom I had met did not talk about the subject, didn't seem to want to talk about it. It seemed to me partly caution, partly a lack of interest, but strong opinions were just not stated. One storekeeper did admit to me that he had to do business with both sides and could not permit himself the luxury of an opinion. He was a graying man in a little gray store, a crossroads place where I stopped for a box of dog biscuits and a can of pipe tobacco. This store might have been anywhere in the nation, but actually it was back in Minnesota. The man had a kind of gray, wistful twinkle in his eyes, as though he remembered humor when it was not against the law, so that I dared go out on a limb. I said, it looks then as though the natural contentiousness of people has died. But I don't believe that. So I'll take just another channel. Can you think, sir, of what that channel might be? You mean, where will they bust out? Where do they bust out? He asks. I was not wrong. The twinkle was there, the precious humorous twinkle. Well, sir, he said, we've got a murder now and then, or we can read about them. Then we got the World Series. You can raise a wind anytime over the Pirates or the Yankees, but I guess the best of all is that we've got the Russians. Feeling pretty strong there? Oh, sure. Hardly a day goes by somebody doesn't take a belt at the Russians. For some reason, he was getting a little easier, even permitted himself a chuckle that could have been turned into a throat clearing if he saw a bad reaction from me. I asked, does anybody know any Russians around here? And how he went all out and laughed. Of course not. That's why they're valuable. Nobody can find fault with you if you take out after the Russians. Because we're not doing business with them? He picked up a cheese knife from the counter and carefully ran his thumb along the edge and laid the knife down. Maybe that's it. By George, maybe that's it. We're not doing business. You think then we might be using Russians as an outlet for something else, for other things? I didn't think that at all, sir, but I bet I'm going to. Why, I remember when people took everything out on Mr. Roosevelt. Andy Larson got red in the face about Roosevelt one time when his hens got in the coop. Yes, sir, he said with growing enthusiasm. These Russians got quite a load to carry. Man has a fright with his wife, he belts the Russians. Maybe everybody needs Russians. I'll bet even in Russia, they need Russians. Maybe they call it Americans. He cut a sliver of cheese from a wheel and held it out to me on the knife blade. You give me something to think about in a sneaking kind of way. I thought you gave it to me. How? About business and opinions. Well, maybe so. You know what I'm going to do? Next time Andy Larson comes in, red in the face, I'm going to see if the Russians are bothering his hens. It was a great loss to Andy when Mr. Roosevelt died. I think what's interesting about this is how much hasn't changed since John Steinbeck wrote this 60 plus years ago. And I think that was what was interesting is that once we got down to a microcosm, America was America and everybody was living their lives. And oftentimes when we actually, sat down and talked to one another, we found that we had so much more in common than we had different. And that if we were able to just sort of be able to set aside what these presumptions of difference were, we would be able to see sort of what it is that we were looking for in each other and finding those sort of places where we were the same. The trip was amazing. We came back in May of 2016. We had friends who lived in Federal Way. And since we had packed up everything that we had owned and put it in storage and had been living our lives out of a 19-foot van, this is where we landed, was back here. And so within a couple of months, we got jobs at Highline and we set down roots.
How did that-
And that is Travels with Charley, at least an excerpt from it. So does anybody have any questions about the trip or the book or anything? Thanks,
How
Karen.
long was the whole trip again?
12 months.
Oh, wow.
Um,
How did you manage not to
Go ahead.
get on each other's nerves, or did you just kind of like go away from each other for a little while?
It was a perfect picture for this question. No, I mean, we were living in 120 square feet for a year with 2 cats. So yes, there was obviously going to be times that we stepped on each other's toes, literally and emotionally. I think that it helps that both of us, we both study communication. So we have a little bit of learned knowledge there, if not actual experience with it. And we're both very stubborn people. And so this was something that we had set out to do. And we really didn't want to fail at it. And so we learned how to work with each other. We learned how to be around each other sort of constantly. And we enjoyed it. I would say, Kara, I won't necessarily speak for you, but I genuinely enjoyed all of it, and learning how to sort of be dependent upon and work with another person in that way.
That's good.